part of running UXDX, our mission, as I said at the start of the day, was to help teams make that shift from projects to product teams. And one of the biggest challenges and things that people come back to us with is they're full of the motivation, but how it's kind of the challenge of actually getting that implemented in their organizations. So I'm going to talk through an approach that I've used successfully for implementing change, and hopefully it's something that you can adopt as well. So on the motivation side, again, we always ask people, are they motivated to change? Have you learned something? And that's the whole point of running these sessions. Have you learned something that you're very motivated about to try and make some changes in the way you're working, or implement, could be design systems or some analytics or something along those lines? And the 88% of people are saying that they're motivated. You would expect that, okay, give a year or so's time, all of these new approaches and ways of working will be implemented. But obviously we're not seeing that in organizations around the world who are still kind of struggling to adopt agile development. And the way I think about it, there's a professor in Stanford called BJ Fogg, and he's developed a behavioral model. And basically he says there's two axes required to make a change happen. There's motivation, which people normally think of as the kind of the key driver, but he says it's the same as the ability axis. So they're both as important as one another. And what he means by ability is, if you have really high motivation, but it's really hard to do something, you're still not going to get the change that you want to do. So if you have that high motivation, you don't need to make it incredibly easy. But if you have low motivation, you have to make it as simple as possible in order to try adopt that change. And then once you've made it easy enough, you just need that trigger to actually kickstart the change. So I'm going to kind of use that and talk about that a bit further. If you want to read more about it, it's been kind of converted into a book by James Clear called Atomic Habits. And he's kind of turned it around to being, how can you personally make change in your life? But it's quite an interesting read, so I'd recommend it if anybody's interested. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about the ability, because I think the motivation side isn't lacking. So let's talk about how we can make it easy for people. In summary, what we're saying is it's a process change. We're saying we want to move from that waterfall kind of project way of working to a product team where you're iterating all the time, continuously iterating. So you're still doing the same thing. At the end of the day, you're developing a software product. So a lot of the steps are quite similar. You're doing some analysis, you're designing what you want to build, you're building it, you're testing it. The difference, I guess, is that you're not relying on the assumption that you know what you need up front in that business case and doing a lot of large, bigger steps. You're focusing on a goal, and then you're incrementally, very small steps, kind of iterating towards it. So at a high level, it doesn't seem like it's that complex of a change. But when you get into the detail of trying to make the changes, that's where you find the problems. And the analogy that I like to think of is organizations. No organization is perfect. And every company will admit that. I think of it like this stack of coffee cups. You can pour a cup of coffee this way. It's a terrible way of pouring a cup of coffee, and it's not very stable and it's brittle, but it works right now. And that's because the kind of the alignment of how things are set up, it works right now. So if you go in there and say, oh, I think one of the cups should be over here, everybody's going to be a bit afraid, because they're going to go, well, the whole stack is going to collapse and then we won't be able to pour a cup of coffee at all. So even though you know that you're trying to do something that's going to improve things, you'll get a lot of resistance. And the way I've found this is that people always do the, well, what about? So I'll propose a change, and then somebody will say, well, what about this? And what would happen, and this happened to me, unfortunately, for quite a few months, of going off and I'd research and I find out and I go, okay, well, this is how we're going to tackle that exact problem. And here's the case studies of who's done it. And they'd spend 5 minutes and they go, okay, well, great, you answered that, but what about this? And then I'd have to go off for a while again and do all the research and come back. And I was chatting to a person, they said that what was happening was what's known, it's a great negotiating tactic. And there's a book about it, negotiating or never split the difference, which is about a hostage negotiator, because he can't say, okay, you've got two hostages, give me one, kill the other, and we'll call it quits. He has to never split the difference. He always has to get both hostages out. And his tactic is to throw it back on the hostage taker. So whenever they ask for something, He just puts it straight back to them, never offering an answer, just going, okay, but what about this problem? And his approach there in doing that is to wear the person down until they eventually get tired, they give up, they get exhausted, make mistakes. And that's the exact same tactic that people are using, probably not so intentionally, but in your organizations, if you found this, that you've proposed something and people are like, oh, well, what about this? What about that? They're using that tactic, and the goal is just to wear you down, and nobody has to worry about it, and it's less work for everyone. So it's not coming from a negative place per se. There are problems with making these changes, as I was showing with the coffee cups, but it is a challenge that needs to be overcome. And just to give a quick example, let's say we were saying, we're going to change from doing our big requirements documents, and we're only going to focus on 1 or 2 user stories. So that's the change I want to make. I'm going to leave everything else the same. Well, what's going to happen then is, after you've convinced your BA and your product owner, okay, let's try this approach. The architects in your organization will go, well, that's a lot of work for us, because we're used to looking at a big document and coming up with the right architecture. And now you want us to work on all these small little stories. That's going to be a hell of a lot more work. So let's say you get agreement that they'll delegate some of the work to the developers. Governance will come around and they'll go, well, we track success based on when you finished your project. It's going to be too much overhead to track every single one of these experiments or user stories that you're running. So then you have to get agreement that, okay, we're going to change how we're going to track progress. And then you move into the progress tracking. So the teams would used to working in big projects. Now you're saying, okay, well, no, you're working on small things. So how do we track that we're getting closer to our goal? And you move from, okay, we've built features, to we've validated assumptions, or we've validated hypotheses. Then you get to the release stage and people are going, okay, well, we've set up for these large releases and people come in at nights and weekends to do these releases. And you want to keep releasing all the time, multiple times a day. So then you need to convince those people. The functional structure needs to change then, because now you're breaking down the barriers between the functions, and the way you fund things might need to change, because funding is often tied to a business case. So as you can see, you start off with a little, I just want to move from, I want to shrink the size of the requirements document that I create. And you've involved about 20 different kind of teams around the organization, and all of them are going, well, what about this? So that's just kind of a brief example of the challenge that you can face, or that I've personally faced as well. And the way I think about it is, it's not that much different to a product. Whenever you have a new idea for a product, you've got the big vision in your head. This is what you're going to achieve with your product. And it's going to have all the bells and whistles. But you know that if you actually, A, it would take a very long time to build that complete product. And B, if you released it, your users will not use it in the way you expect it. It won't be as good as you expect it to be. So we know from experience that you have to do kind of iterative development, get something out there, test it, pivot, learn from the feedback. And user story mapping is the best tool that I've seen for helping to manage that gap between the big vision of the product that you have in your head versus the individual kind of steps to get towards it. So doing the MVP first and then keep iterating further. And how a user story map works, for those who aren't aware, is you do a high-level user journey across the top. And that user journey is kind of just the very broad strokes what you need to do. And you get everybody to brainstorm on the yellow post-its of what are the different features that are needed to deliver in that journey. And then you kind of sort them by priority, getting everyone to agree what's the absolute critical thing to get end to end. And that's how you get your MVP, your release 1, your release 2, and you kind of have generally a pile that will get done at a future point. So I find user story maps very useful for product development, but I also think that they're a great tool to handle the challenges in organization change as well. So what I've done and what we're working on at the moment is developing a full user story map for change. So I've taken those steps that I used in my example, and they're the user journey, and they're all the different functions that need to be involved in getting a change to happen. And then down the left, instead of releases, kind of done broad strokes about what are the different high-level process stages that teams often go through as they're developing. And then you have the kind of the actions that people need to do in order to deliver on that. But there isn't a one size fits all. And this is what I said at the start. So there isn't a user story map that you can hand to every organization and they can immediately take that, because it actually depends on each individual team in the organization and the products that they're working on. And so I'm going to give a few examples now from my time in Aer Lingus of how I applied that to different teams, looking at their specific examples and where they were at their stage of maturity. So the three different teams that I worked with were the website team, the mobile apps team, and the API, the B2B team. They were looking after the API. Now, the way we had split the teams in Aer Lingus is what you would call a horizontal slice. So they were looking at different horizontal layers of the technology stack. Ideally, we would move towards vertical slice teams where a team can own the full stack end to end. But it is good for an organization that's coming from a legacy waterfall way of working. This kind of intermediary step of horizontal slices, I'd recommend it as a good first step to kind of get used to the product way of working. And then when they encounter the challenges of that, to shift towards the vertical slicing. So let's look at the web team first. So this was probably the most waterfall team when I joined, going back a few years now. So we just said, let's start with the basics. Let's get agile development up and running here. So that was kind of where we were starting to look. Let's change some of the governance metrics. Let's figure out how we do our work breakdown. And two of the big challenges that we faced in trying to implement this was the teams were so siloed that they actively almost avoided collaboration. It was, if ever it needed to be collaboration, it had to be a document. So the designs had to be fully signed off. I'm not going to talk to a designer as a developer. I'm waiting for the designs to be signed off. And the designers were not talking to the developers because there was a challenge with funding and all of those other internal politic issues. And that led to a lack of delivery accountability, because each person was just saying, I'm responsible for my job. I'm not responsible for the end-to-end. That everyone was going, oh, we did everything perfectly. And yet we were still delayed in getting things out the door. And the cause of these problems was that model of, well, we're going to design everything up front. So there is the assumption that we can do perfect communication and documentation because everybody, it's agreed exactly what we need. And that's how the communication went. So what we did to address this was we were starting a new project. And we said, okay, well, let's start with the collaboration and let's try to get to more agile development on this project. We said, what's the biggest challenge that the team faces? And this project was the airlingus.com website was very poor on mobile phones. And it was, let's make that much better experience on mobiles. So the team brainstormed and said, our biggest challenge is the seat map. So a seat map on a plane, there's a lot of information that needs to be shown, and mobile is a small screen. So they thought that this was going to take weeks to try figure it out, and a lot of design and dev iterations. Everybody got together. We got the full team into a room, dev, design, research, QA, and just a whole day working and prototyping together to try figure something out, and had a working prototype at the end of one day. So that short-circuited so much time and effort. And since then, there's numerous kind of workshops and hackathons before starting any piece of work to kind of short-circuit a lot of those rework cycles that happen later on. And the other one was around, so we had started to break down the barriers between the teams, but they were still tracking their pieces of work separately after we had done the hackathon. So we said, okay, let's break that down as well. And one of the biggest challenges was just tools. Each team used a different tool. The design team used one tool, research team used a different tool, devs used one, QA used another. So what we did was we got everybody together and agreed what the one single tool should be, so we can track every piece of work in the life cycle, whether it's in the discovery phase or the delivery phase. So it might seem quite simple, but we all just agreed on a single Jira flow and got everybody to buy in. And that remarkably took a long time, because again, it's down to people and change, and nobody wanted to budge on their process, whereas we needed to get agreement from everybody, and there had to be a give and take. But since then, it's really helped that collaboration. So that was kind of a very early stage team. The mobile apps team was much more, it was a product team from the start. And what had happened was when mobile apps were coming of age, they were just set up in the corner and told, oh, just go off and do your thing. But the challenge that started happening was when enough revenue started coming through, it became seen as a very critical and important channel. And then suddenly it needed to adhere to all of the standards and practices and processes of the rest of the organization, which really conflicted with their way of working. So we said, okay, well, you've already got the agile dev bit down, but our continuous integration isn't great. We're not testing and automating our testing. We're not being able to release frequently enough. So the funding was a big challenge because, as I said, they had to start adhering to the rest of the processes. So they needed a business case before they could get funding to work on anything. So what we did there was we said, well, let's do a fake it till we make it approach. We created a business case. We sized our team. We said how much it was going to cost. We spent a day with the team brainstorming on what would be good ideas to put into the business case. And we just put together a business case and got it signed off so that we were able to go back to our product team, cross-functional collaboration way of working. And that was great until we actually ended up only delivering about half of what was in the business case, because the business decided they wanted working with the business case model because we were able to demonstrate with data why it was not working as well as they thought it would and how it can work better. Sorry. From a structural point of view, there was also a big pushback on quick releases. So QA were really worried about being able to release too quickly, that they wouldn't be able to test the product sufficiently. And this was coming because the QA saw themselves as the last line of defense before things got out into the public. And that meant that there could be a lack of ownership of quality throughout the rest of the team. So for example, the QA always said devs don't have any focus on quality and they're just throwing crap over and we have to fix everything. So there was this kind of conflict within the team. And what we did was we said, okay, let's try an experiment. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the ways of working, but we're going to absolve everybody of responsibility. I personally took all the responsibility and said, if something goes wrong, and if we release a bad product or if there's a lot of bugs in production, there'll be no comeback on anybody else. I'll take full responsibility, but we want to test something out. And just doing that let people relax a little bit. They weren't as fearful anymore. And we were able to implement some changes that really dramatically reduced our time to production by 30% in 3 months. So that was like a really big win. So that's just kind of how we addressed that structural challenge. We took the fear away from people. And then the B2B side of things, again, these were an even more mature team. So they had full automated testing, but we wanted to get to the ability to be able to just deliver continuously. So whenever we had a fix, just push it in, deliver it out, get it out instantaneously. The big challenge that we faced with this team was the time to test. So they had a huge test suite. It would take 9 hours to run. And the big challenge with that was if you made a change in 1 day, you'd run the test suite, you'd have to wait until the next day to figure out if it worked. If it didn't, you'd make a fix, run the test suite, wait till the next day. So we were dragging on quite a few days on some simple fixes. So what we did there was we just set the team a target and said, you have maximum 30 minutes to run the test suite, but we don't want a dip in quality. So go out there, investigate how you can do it. And they came up with some really great ideas, working together and without cutting on the quality, they reduced some duplication in some places, did some parallelization in others, reduced it very quickly to 2 hours. And then it became a lot more of a battle to kind of keep chipping away at the time. So, but 2 hours meant that we were able to run 2 or 3 test suites in each day, and we were able to get our products released a lot quicker. So that was just a way of trying to explain how we looked at different kind of levels of maturity and tried to tailor our way of implementing the change to the needs of each team individually. So then when it comes to the trigger, there is no good time. There's always going to be a deadline. There's always going to be oh, we'll do it at the end of this. We've just got to rush, and everybody's got to jump on to get over this hurdle, and then we'll have this amazing free time. I've never seen the free time. There's always just an immediate deadline straight after the next one, and there never is a good time. So unfortunately with these things, you have to make the time. So you just have to figure out, okay, everybody's on board, let's go with it. Because nobody's going to give you permission. Nobody's going to carve away the time. I found that the best thing is just to get on and do it. So to recap, to get any change to happen, you need motivation, you need to make it easy, and a trigger. So the motivation isn't lacking. From this day to day, I'm hoping that you'll come up with a lot of ideas on how you can improve your processes. I think the user story model way of framing the kind of changes that we need to do is the best way to prevent those what about questions. So when somebody says, what about this? You can say, yes, we've thought of that. It's down here, and it's not our immediate focus right now. And this is how we can handle it in the current space and then it kind of focuses back on, this is our MVP. We're not going to stop here. We're going to continuously improve this process. And then the trigger is just to do it. So I hope that was useful for you, and I hope that might help with you in implementing some changes. If you're interested in that user story model approach, we are going to be releasing it in October. We're still busy writing all of the steps. There's 60 odd different steps in the different levels, but we will be releasing that along with some assessments at our conference in October. So do please reach out if it's of interest, and I have time for some questions if there are any.